Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gilad Sommer. I'm a student and a teacher at the new Acropolis School in Chicago. And today I'm going to present the topic of you are what you think. The mind, friend or enemy? We are going to speak a little bit about our minds, its effect on our lives, and to ask this question of whether is it something that is helping us in life or inhibiting us in life, or maybe both. And I want to start with some quotes of wisdom. The first one comes from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu epic, one of the most famous writings in Hindu literature. And it goes like this: the mind is an enemy to those who do not control it. So we see, first of all, we are told that the mind is potentially an enemy for us if we don't control it. Another source, which comes from a different tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, tells us the happiness we seek, a genuine, lasting peace and happiness, can be attained only through the purification of our minds. This is by the Dalai Lama in a book on Tibetan Buddhism. And this is a very strong assertion, right? That a genuine, lasting peace and happiness can be attained only through the purification of our minds. What exactly do we mean by purification of our minds? We'll talk about that later on. And finally, a quote from a philosopher is going to accompany us today, to inspire us today. James Allen: a man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts. You are today when your thoughts have brought you. You will be tomorrow where your thoughts take you. In New Acropolis, we have an eclectic approach to philosophy, which means that we don't focus on one specific philosophy, on one specific tradition, but we try to take the best ideas from the different traditions, best in the sense of practical, transformative, positive, conducive to growth and to a better life. And today, in this topic of you are what you think, we're going to be inspired much by the British philosopher James Allen, as I mentioned, who focused a lot of his writings on this idea of the mind, inspired very much by the Eastern traditions. So a little bit about James Allen, because we're going to mention him or mention some of his writings a little bit today. So James Allen was a British writer, poet, philosopher who lived at the end of the 19th century, wrote mainly at the beginning of the 20th century. He was born in England and experienced a significant life event at the age of 15 when his father was murdered in New York, and he had to become sort of the man of the house. And later on, after reading The Light of Asia, which was a book that sort of tried to bring the story of Siddhartha Gautama, which we know as the Buddha, to the West. He read this book and he was very inspired by it, completely changed his outlook on life, and eventually decided to completely dedicate his life to writing about not only teachings from the East, but mainly his own reflections about how our thoughts, our inner world affects our everyday life. He wrote 19 books, and you can find it, if you want, on Amazon or any other source, this small tome. It's called Mind is the Master. But if you don't want to read, and you don't need to, all the 19 books he wrote. You can also get his most well-known work, which is called As a Man Thinketh. And this small book also has a lot of treasures, a lot of very interesting ideas. Not only interesting intellectually, but very practical and transformative. So, a recommendation. I want to start, after we read these quotes, I want to start with a question, which is, what determines the nature of our lives? What determines the nature of our lives? If we look at our lives, at the circumstances of our lives, our external and our internal circumstances, and by external circumstances, I mean the place we live in, our family, our relationships, our job, all these different circumstances that are outside of ourselves. And by internal circumstances, I mean all those circumstances that are within ourselves, our emotions, our thoughts, and so on. And the question is, what determines the nature of these circumstances and or the nature of our lives as it is right now? Why are we in the situations we are in? Why do our relationships look as they do? And usually when we answer this question, we usually sort of project the answer to our circumstances. It means we are what we are because of our external circumstances, because we were born to a certain situation, because of our external characteristics, because of where we are, where we live, and so on. In other words, we sort of tend to blame or to put the responsibility over our lives on the external circumstances. Another option, which we're going to sort of investigate today, is that a lot of the circumstances of our life, whether external or internal, are the result of the way we think, as a result of our mindsets. I wanna present a few scenarios as an example to show what I mean. Let's take the first scenario, a job interview or first date, which happen to have a lot in common. And let's take two people. Person A comes to this scenario with a lack of confidence that leads to a sort of an anxiety or being anxious to impress, always thinking about trying to figure out what the other person wants to hear, and then trying to sort of act in the way that we think that person expects us to behave. A fear of failing, fear of failure, this belief that if I fail this interview or if I fail this date, then there won't be any others. It's the end of the world. This is the first person. Now, person B approaches the same situation, calm and natural, being oneself, with knowledge that if this interview or date fails, there will be others. And more importantly, knowing that if I'm oneself, if I'm myself, and the interview or date doesn't go well, maybe it's a sign that it's probably not the right place, or not the right person for me. Yeah. So these are two different approaches to the same situation, same circumstance, but we can imagine that these two approaches, these two mindsets will lead to two very different results. Now, in both the situations, we don't have a guarantee for success. But in the second situation with person B, it's clear that there are more chances of success, And moreover, not only success, but also there are more chances to find the right person or the right job. Okay. Let's look at scenario 2. A co-working situation. We have to teamwork with other people, whether at work or in any other circumstance. The first person, person A again, always thinking about how to do the least amount of work, very much envious of others, and doesn't want the others to be viewed positively by the boss, by the person in charge. And that leads to a sort of inflexibility in regards to one's suggestions, because that person wants his or her suggestion to be chosen, to be the one that is used, because then they get credit. And that's the first person. The second person, person B, approaches the situation with an attitude of service. They want to do the best possible thing. And they don't care if it's their suggestion or another person's suggestions. They're not trying to impress anybody, not the boss, not their team workers, co-workers, sorry. And that makes them open to others, makes them open to others' suggestions, and to sort of being able to work with others in an easier way. Again, we have the same situation, two different approaches, two different mindsets, which will lead to two completely different results. Finally, our third scenario, someone says something that is perceived as offensive or hurtful. And again, we have these two approaches. The first person, person A, gets hurt, assumes the worst motivations. And by that, I mean sort of trying to go into the mind of the other person, to assume that the person has an agenda, has a negative, evil intention, that this hurtful or offensive thing they said was on purpose, and so on, without really knowing that's so. This person keeps thinking about it, mulling it over in one's mind, and finally they find a way to get back at that person one way or another. And if they can't get back at that person, they will get back at another person who is somehow similar to that person, connected to that person. The second person, person B, approaches it differently, doesn't take it personally, doesn't assume that they know what the other person thinks. And eventually either they talk about it with that person or just let it go. Yeah. Again, the same circumstance, the same situation, two different mindsets. And we can imagine that these two different mindsets will also lead to two completely different results. So, with these examples, we can see something very interesting, that the circumstances are not as influential or impactful as the way we approach the circumstances, as the mindsets in which we approach the circumstances. We can say that our mental states dictate our actions, our reactions, and our interpretations of the world. In a way, and this is something we find in common in many ancient philosophies and traditions, the human being is a mind being, is a mental being. What makes us unique as human beings is the fact that we are capable of using our minds, of changing our minds, of choosing the mindset that we want to approach things with. So animals don't really have this ability, for example. A shark cannot decide to become a vegetarian because it feels bad for the fish, or to sort of join the fish and fight for justice against the other sharks. An animal has a certain mindset perhaps, but it is a set mindset. It is a determined, fixed mindset. It is what it is. Yeah. And that's what we like about animals. We like them because they're natural, they're authentic. They don't have the ability to deceive, to be not authentic. However, human beings are different. We have the ability to choose our mindset, to consciously reflect, to consciously choose our actions, and to change and transform our mindsets if we find that they're not productive, that they don't lead to a good way of life. Yeah. The thing is that we usually tend to focus on changing our external circumstances. If we can imagine the spotlight of our consciousness, it's usually focused on the outside. It's usually focused on the things outside of us that we want to change. We neglect what I would call inner work. We work all our lives to change our circumstances, but we neglect to change our inner situations, our inner circumstances. We don't focus our spotlight in how we feel, how we think, with the aim of changing it. We also seek our happiness in these external circumstances, even though we just saw in these examples that our happiness and the results of our everyday life are very much dependent not on the external circumstances, but our internal circumstances. We can see different people going through the same external circumstances and having a completely different result from the same circumstances. We see people going through the same circumstances and inside experiencing them completely differently, in a completely different way. And this is very important. Now, we don't study this at school. Nobody teaches us this at school, right? At school, we learn what is the capital of this and that state and that country. We learn how to calculate the area of a triangle. We learn the history of the United States, but nobody teaches us really how to work with our minds. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one is a more individual reason. To work with our minds, to work with our inner world is a much more abstract and subtle thing than to work with external things that we can touch, that we can see, that we can hear. These things that are outside of us, I can grab them, I can touch them. And it's much easier for us to put our minds to it. To work with our inner world is something that is much more subtle. And we have to go inside also, which is something that's a little bit scary for us. The other reason we don't learn this really at school, and you may call me a cynic, but I think it's more of a social reason, that let us say that a person who is more reflective, more conscious, more mindful, is a person that is less inclined for us, I would say, a consumer lifestyle, a consumer way of life. Because a person like that, for example, has much less compulsive buying. He reflects really, or he or she reflect on what do I really need in life. And they find out very quickly that we don't need a lot to be happy. And when I realize that, when a person realizes that they don't need a lot to be happy, then that's not very conducive to a consumer lifestyle, right? So I really believe that is one of the reasons we don't really learn this at school or anywhere, actually, right? So what we really want to do, what we really need to do in order to be able to change our mindsets, and this is something that we find in all the philosophical traditions, is that we really need to start by knowing ourselves. We really need to start by turning this spotlight of our consciousness from the outside inside. To look at ourselves really and to see what's inside of me. What are my faults? What are my strengths? What are my mindsets? What is the mindset I approach things in life with? This is the very basic thing and fundamental things we have to do. Let's take some quotes from James Allen in the matter. A man's mind, and of course when he's writing in the beginning of 20th century English, of course we're referring here to man, woman, or others. A man's mind may be likened to a garden, which may be intelligently cultivated or allowed to run wild. But whether cultivated or neglected, it must and will bring forth. This is very important. So I don't know if you ever had the chance to do some gardening, but one of the basic actions of gardening, I'm not an expert in gardening, but we have been doing some work in a community garden nearby. And one of the basic works in gardening is weeding. That means to recognize what are the plants I want to grow and what plants I don't want to grow. And the reason I weed out the plants I don't want to grow is that they take energy, water from the plants I do want to grow. And James Allen compared this process to the process we need to do with our mind. We have to choose what mindsets, what thoughts, what inclinations we want to cultivate, we want to nourish, and which mindsets we don't want to nourish. So the important thing is, however, is that the plant is going to bring forth anyway. That means it's going to bring fruits, to give fruits. That means if I neglect to sort of weed out the negative mind states, mental states, they're going to give results, going to give fruits anyway. So we have to sort of be gardeners of our own minds and very perceptive on what we let in our minds and what we don't let in our minds. Another quote from James Allen, very interesting. Every established mental condition is an acquired habit, and it has become such by continuous repetition of thought. This connects very much to what Aristotle tells us when he says that a virtue is a thing of habit. And it's true. But it's also true not just about virtues, it's also true about shortcomings, weaknesses, and faults. That means if we have a certain mental habit, it is because we have nourished it. It's because we have let it grow. And we have fed it with continuous thought, continuous repetition of thought. So that tells us that after we recognize, using reflection, after we recognize these negative patterns of thinking, we have to stop nourishing them by sort of keep thinking them. And we need to start nourishing the more positive habits of thought. Another interesting idea from James Allen, which connects very much to, in general, the practice of philosophy, is this idea of life as a school. Let me read a quote. As a progressive and evolving being, man is where he is that he may learn, that he may grow. And as he learns the spiritual lesson which any circumstance contains for him, it passes away and gives place to other circumstances. So, In other words, or in 21st century English, life is a school. There are actually different ways we can approach life. We can look at life as a burden. We can look at life as something to just pass through, as an opportunity to make money, to expand our comfort, to just have fun. We can look at it in different ways. A more philosophical approach to life is that it is a school. And what does it mean that it is a school? It means that every experience that we have, and every day we have many experiences, every experience that we have is an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to face those mind states that we still have that are not conducive to a good life, that are based on false assumptions, that are not based on reality, and to sort of melt them, dissolve them, work with them. Every circumstance is sort of a reflection of our inner state of being, every circumstance of our life. And if we look at these circumstances in this way, we can actually change our way of being, improve our way of being, and move forward in the school of life. But if we choose not to look at the circumstances in that way, if we choose to ignore the lessons life brings us, the same thing that happens to us in school will happen to us in life. We're just going to stay class, stay in the same grade, sort of face again and again the same circumstances, the same trials, the same difficulties, until we sort of pass the test. Now, how do we do that? We can try doing it by ourselves, and that's an option. But if we look at the experience of humanity, we see that we have certain sort of experiments or certain experiences, certain settings that appear throughout history exactly to help the human being, to help us to do that process of learning the art of living, learning philosophy as a way of life. And these are the schools of philosophy. If we look at the schools of philosophy of ancient times, for example, the Stoic school of philosophy, the Academy, the schools of Confucius or the Buddhism in the East, we find that the schools of philosophy at that time didn't see philosophy so much as an intellectual, theoretical pursuit of knowledge, or sort of theorizing about different ideas, or reading very complicated books, or about debates that may be interesting but have no relevance to everyday life. For them, philosophy was the love of wisdom, a way to approach wisdom, a method to approach wisdom. In other words, a path to climb those stairs that we saw before, those steps in the school of life. And part of this discipline of philosophy is about really mastering our minds, mastering the way we approach the world, the way we approach life, and expanding our understanding of ourselves, of the events around us, of other people. And this is also what we're trying to do at New Acropolis, which is in a way a continuation of those ancient schools of philosophy. It is also a school of philosophy as a way of life. And through philosophy, through the study of philosophy, through volunteering, through art and culture, we study and apply these teachings, these ideas that are found in every tradition of humanity, every ancient tradition of humanity, whether it is from the East or the West. And therefore, I will end this short presentation of a topic which we can discuss for hours and hours without end. But really, the point is not so much about discussing the topics. These discussions and talks are very helpful for us, but eventually the bottom line is about what we can apply. It's about what we can live. Today we have access to so much knowledge. Let us reflect on the fact that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, to have 10 books in your library was considered a privilege of people who had a very high standard of living. Today, each of us can have access to endless amounts of books and knowledge and YouTube videos and lectures. But all this knowledge means nothing if it's only there to adorn the shelves of our minds, if it has no practicality, if it's not applied in our everyday life. That is why it's important to have a method. It's important to have a system, a way to apply these things in our lives, a guide, a co-students to sort of practice it together with us. And that is why I would like to invite you to join either a presentation or an open class for our Living Philosophy course, which is our first introductory course to what we call philosophy as a way of life. If you live in Chicago, you can find information about it in our website or our Facebook page. You'll find information in the information about the video. And if you live in other cities around the US or in other countries, you can look up the international website or in your own language to look for New Acropolis, because New Acropolis exists in about 500 or more cities around the world. So you can try and find and see if you have a New Acropolis school near you. In any case, we have a lot of online activities right now because of the situation. So you're invited to search this up, Google this up, or look again at the website. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for the time, for listening to me, and I hope to see you in one of our events.